There you go. Hi, Chris.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that introduction, and Rob, thank you also for setting the context. As you were talking, Rob, it made me think about the joint meeting of the boards, which we participated in maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, um, and the sort of amazing thing that happened in the lead up to that for us organizationally was that our executive director at the time, Tony Lake, had asked us to really push the joint meeting of the boards. So this was about 6 UN agencies presenting to our joint boards to talk about failure. And Rob and I were sitting in a meeting with the other 4 agencies and trying to figure out how we could get our executive directors at varying levels of willingness to talk about a failure that they had had. And I remember at some point in the discussion, one of the agencies saying, "This whole discussion is totally not fair. It's not okay. UNICEF has such better failures than everybody else. You guys are better at failing." And I thought that was a certain type of benchmark that I'd never expected to meet in my life. But the joint meeting of the boards was very interesting because as a precursor to the event that Rob mentioned yesterday, I think it shows how far we've come as a UN system. And as we've seen in our discussions across agencies, we're all at different levels of maturity in how able we are to talk about failures, to talk about successes. And so we really wanted to reflect for a minute at the beginning of our journey, going back even before 2013, 14 to before the joint meeting of the boards, to see how we in UNICEF had started to prep the culture, to prepare the culture for the change that we thought it would need to have in order for us to be more open about our own failures. And I don't think we're by any means perfect or even very good at talking about our failures, but we're certainly better than we were 5 years ago. Next slide, please. There we go. Yeah, we thought we were really smart. Next slide, please. I'm going to go very quickly. These slides are all available. The story that I wanted to tell really started with a trip that I had taken in 2007 and then another one in 2009 to visit these schools in Kampala and in Moroto in Uganda. I apparently wore a dress shirt back then and looked a little bit different. But the schools that we were working with were part of a very ambitious program that we had set up at UNICEF to connect classrooms to the internet, to connectivity, and to each other. And we found, as everybody who was working in the sort of education and technology space had found at this point, that obviously just providing connectivity didn't do very much, and that connectivity left quite quickly when bills were not paid or when attention drifted. So we had all of these schools which we thought we were connecting, and kids who we thought were building their own pages on Wikipedia to share their work with others. And when I came back a year later, they'd actually created Wikipedia pages on paper because the connectivity had died. Next slide, please. And so in 2009 or so, we had this amazing idea to look outside of UNICEF to see what other people were doing as they tried to provide connectivity to remote areas. And this is a digital doorway built by the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. This digital doorway provides a wonderful opportunity to learn to kids in parts of South Africa. But as you can see from that picture, the kids who are working on this and playing with it and learning from it are boys, mostly ages 14 and up. Next slide, please. We thought we could take a version of that digital doorway and build our own at UNICEF. So we did a fantastic piece of conceptual design work. We drew some pictures and created user stories. This is our version of what a digital doorway could look like for the UNICEF context. In South Africa, that platform worked well because it was in fixed and protected areas. But we thought, as UNICEF, who works in emergencies and has a different set of context, we needed something more portable. Next slide, please. And so, in fact, we actually built a version of this portable digital doorway for use in emergencies. And you can see that's Seth, who was one of our hardware engineers at the time. And he built a thing that you could put on a plane and go quickly to an emergency, set it up, and start providing education and content to kids the same way we do with our School in a Box kits. And UNICEF distributes about 100,000 School in a Box kits every year. We thought this could be the new School in a Box. Next slide, please. We even had some very, very smart people come and talk about the School in a Box kit. And here you have people from MIT and New York University, from governments in Kenya and Tanzania talking about what we could do. And you'll notice that those solar panels in the back of this picture are standing alone. The digital doorway that we had built, the B, is gone. It at this point had broken. We took it on one trip, deployed it in one emergency, and it broke immediately. But that's okay because we were failing fast. So we talked about the concept again. Next slide, please. And out of this, we decided we needed something more rugged. So we went back to the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa, and they created another prototype. This is 2010. This prototype that you can see there was very rugged. You could drop it off of a truck. It was essentially a laptop with all this equipment for broadcasting content out to kids. And we were quite proud of that. The problem is that it cost a lot more than, and this was when laptops were still, rugged laptops were still fairly expensive, but this was much more expensive than any solution we could have bought off the shelf. However, we were quite proud that we had gone to prototype 2 so quickly. Next slide, please. And at the same time, back in Uganda, we were still trying to figure out how in Moroto or in Kitgum, how we could figure out if there was any way to provide content and connectivity in an ongoing fashion. We worked with local engineers and designers, and the guys up on the top worked at a car mechanic shop in Kampala to build this new version, this third iteration of our idea for distributing content and connectivity. And this is the digital drum. Now, the digital drum is an oil container, an oil drum that's been repurposed and has open source hardware and software inside of it that provides educational content that we took from the South African initiative and that works with the students that we've been working with in the schools in Uganda. And we thought still that we were quite smart. Next slide, please. And we thought we were so smart because we even got awards in magazines for this, and we had photos of kids using it, and it was plugged in on the side of a youth center there. And at the end of the day, I think today in 2018, there are 0 of these digital drums in use. The digital doorways that were built in South Africa are still being used there, and our platform for providing education in emergencies did not work. Next slide, please. But out of this whole process, and I think these types of failures are common, out of this we were inspired to do a second engagement with education and learning. And I've sent in the notes from this call a series of 3 blog posts we did, because after we failed to create our own hardware for learning in Uganda, we thought we could start to try to take some of the learnings we had from that and apply it to a massive program for refugees from Iraq in Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt. And in about 2012 and 13, we started a new project called COA. And I've shared the 3 blog posts that we wrote as COA failed fantastically. The idea of that project was to get 250,000 refugees, kids, back into places where they could learn, using all the same concepts that we'd prototyped from the digital doorway and the digital drum. And we got 460 kids into learning environments. Absolute disastrous failure. And we spent time and money and our partners' time and really weren't able to do anything because we didn't follow some of the basic learnings that we should have seen out of the 2 earlier failures. The failure that we had in the second time and our ability to capture it led us to do a few things inside of UNICEF, which I wanted to quickly share with you as the sort of acupuncture and pressure points that we need in order to start changing culture. And if we can go to the next slide, please. One of the things that came out of these many failures was the ability to codify and to collect what we'd learned into a set of principles. It's always nice to start a story with a human touch, but it's very important at the level that many of us work at in this large international organizations to end the story with something that's accessible, that's normative, and that we can share around. And so these principles of innovation, which you can now find as the principles for digital development, have been signed off on by 300 different partners and groups, UN agencies, governments, and so on, and essentially crystallize many of the things that we should have done that we did incorrectly. We did super wrong in these projects, and create a set of frameworks and templates for organizations to use. And we've referenced these, and in fact, in the special session yesterday, 2 days ago at the UNICEF board, these were talked about by some of our partner governments and member states as things that they've even used in their own procurement, in their own development and aid work and actually in their own technology work as ways to build projects that aren't quite as big failures as the ones that I mentioned. Next, please. Internally, we also started a set of Failure Fridays. And this is, sometimes people say sort of like, well, where could we start with failure? How could we start talking about it? And Failure Fridays for us were the very most simple building block. They started in our team in UNICEF, and they sort of grew in the organization. And we found different country offices running a similar methodology. And it's just a very basic managerial technique that anybody can do. Sit down at the end of the week, have some coffee, have some snacks, and everybody goes around in a circle and says something that they succeeded at that worked really well, something that they failed at, and something that confused them. And this works well in groups of 5 to 10 to 15 people. But suddenly you get team members talking about, and you can see now I have more gray hair in that picture, but suddenly you can have team members talking about failure, talking about what didn't work, and starting to help each other out. And it's a very small technique, but many of our organizations work like fractals. So once you start something in one area, if it's easy to replicate, it can grow and scale. Next slide, please. We also had a set of external discussions called fail fairs. And this slide here, what went wrong, was a slide probably from 2012, 2013, where we did a failure fair with UNDP, the World Bank, WFP, and others. And we were able to take some of that same type of discourse from Failure Fridays, but really do it in a much larger and more public setting. We had journalists there. We had member states at this fail fair. There were about 50 people in the audience. And we were talking about these types of programmatic failures. And it's sort of easy to talk about a small programmatic failure like the ones that I mentioned, especially when the organization hasn't lost a lot of money, reputation, or time. It's much more difficult to talk about a complex, multi-layered failure, but we'll get there in a second. These failure fairs were something, again, that is a management trick. It's easy, it's fun, it doesn't take a lot of work, but it starts to get the culture talking. And we got a deputy executive director to come and host one of the failure fairs for us at the time. And I remember how surprised and proud he was to be talking about failure. And there was something that he took back with him to our senior management team and sort of started spreading at that level as well. Next slide, please. Finally, in UNICEF's 2013 to 2017 strategic plan, we were able to build in failure as a metric, and failure as a metric for success that we could start to count. I've also included in the resources for this the suggested KPIs around failure that we included in that strategic plan. When we start to think about failure and think about it really at an organizational level, we need to talk much beyond project failures. However, project failures and initial investment failures are sometimes pointers to an ability to have a larger systematic discussion. So you'll see many of the indicators that we put in start with an individual, a team, a project, and a budget level failure, but really point to something much more deep. And these are questions of agility, of adaptability, and questions that we as managers need to be conscious of as the world is changing so quickly. And these are the things that Rob mentioned at the very beginning. Now, I'll end this story with a very sad note, which is that these KPIs for failure are actually not in UNICEF's newest strategic plan. So we have failed again to fail. And still, we're on the hunt for how exactly those KPIs got washed out in the newest version. But we're confident that just like waves bring something up to the beach once and maybe bring it back again, we will find these in a later iteration of our strategic plan. Even the fact that they were in there once, though, has helped us create a set of discussions with our country and regional offices where we can start to lay the foundation for a more agile and adaptable organization. I believe that's the last of my slides, so I'll end there. Thank you all for giving me your time this morning.